Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with Dr. Joe Vipond, an emergency physician practicing at the Foothills Medical Centre in Calgary. He was also one of the organisers for both the Alberta and Canadian call phase-outs, and a past president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. I'm also talking with Dr. Christopher Ragan, an associate professor and the founding director of McGill University's McGill School of Public Policy, as well as the past chair of Canada's Ecofiscal Commission. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. So hi, Joe and Chris. Thank you for joining me today, and welcome to the Environment in Canada podcast. Before we begin, do you mind quickly saying a few words about who you are and what you do?
My name is Chris Ragan. I am an economics professor at McGill and have been here for way too long. And I'm now the director of the McGill School of Public Policy. And probably the reason that I'm in this conversation is that I was the chair of the Ecofiscal Commission for 6 years that ended a few years ago. And we spent a lot of our time talking about climate change and climate policy and carbon pricing and how to do it and how to do it right.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Joe Vipond. I'm an emergency doctor in Calgary, Alberta, and I don't have the bona fides that Chris has, and so I'm a little outclassed. But what I do have is a lot of concern about the climate crisis. I think about this a lot. I talk about this a lot, and so I'm always happy to get my opinion out there, even if it's not as informed, say, as Dr. Ragan's.
Well, that's fine. I mean, I would not necessarily say that I am the most informed on this. I'm definitely not an economist or in any way a health care professional. So I come from this purely from communications. I do have an MA in environmental policy, so maybe I shouldn't sell myself too short, but still, it's one of these subjects where I think it's good that actually we're getting multiple perspectives on it. We've dealt with this issue before on the podcast, and in the first episode, we dealt very much with some of the things that were going around at the time around carbon pricing and what people were saying and some of the misinformation we were hearing about it. Since then, I kind of want to jump straight into one of the key things we've heard since, which is people keep coming back and saying, whether they've reviewed the evidence or not, where's the proof that carbon pricing actually works? And I'm curious, what evidence is there for carbon pricing working for those who are curious?
Well, I guess my answer to that is that there have been lots of studies over many jurisdictions over many years. I mean, we're still fairly early in this whole thing, right? But when the Ecofiscal Commission came out with its first report on carbon pricing, which was in 2015, at the time we surveyed the literature and we looked at, evidence from California and evidence from Denmark and evidence from the European Union and evidence from other jurisdictions. It is relatively new evidence, but there is solid and growing evidence that carbon pricing works. And you can have a cap and trade system like the European Union. You can have a carbon tax like British Columbia and like our federal backstop policy. But these policies do work. But what they don't do is they don't work dramatically in short periods of time. They work bit by bit over time. And especially as the carbon price rises, then it tends to do more work, which is not surprising. So I think there is a fair amount of evidence, and that evidence is growing.
So if you look at a report that was just out recently by the Canadian Climate Institute as to what policies are making a big difference right now, they really focused on industrial carbon pricing as doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and that I guess leads us to say that there's two different carbon prices going on in Canada right now. There's a consumer-based carbon price, and an industrial-based carbon price. And if you really want to look at how powerful that industrial carbon price is, I guess one of my bona fides is that I was involved in the Alberta and Canadian coal phase-outs about a decade ago. And both of those, in 2015, the Alberta one said no more coal after 2030. And then in 2016, the federal government said no more coal after 2029. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? In Alberta, the last bit of coal is planned to be burned this summer, 6 years ahead of schedule. So even though I was told it was impossible to happen a decade ago, now we're actually doing it way ahead of schedule. And you have industrial carbon pricing to thank for that. That would not have happened. It just, these private companies in Alberta are making decisions, and they do a spreadsheet. It's just a simple Excel spreadsheet where they put in the carbon price, the rising amount, they compare it to natural gas or other generation. And it quickly becomes obvious that coal, being so dirty, being so CO2 intensive, is non-economic. So the great for industrial carbon pricing, lots of evidence there. I would say from the consumer price, I would echo what Chris says. We really haven't given it the length of time to really have an impact on some of those bigger decisions, right? Like which car to buy, like which furnace to replace in your house. Those items have long lifespans, and therefore the replacement time is slow. And I think we still haven't seen enough of that impact on those decisions.
But can I jump in there? Because the difference between the distinction between the industrial carbon pricing and the retail carbon price is, I think there's going to be some interesting lessons here, because the basic economic theory is that businesses will try to cut their costs, and they will respond to the carbon price by, using less coal, as Joe just explained. And it's the same basic idea that for households, right? Households would like to cut their costs on an unnecessary tax, and they would like to substitute and change their behavior. But I think businesses do this better. Businesses do this because they really care on a quarterly basis about their bottom line. I think consumers do care about their bottom line, but we are also sort of creatures of habit. And I think it just takes a little bit longer and probably a little bit higher carbon price for consumers to sort of get it and to figure out how to change their behavior. And it's funny when I talk across the country about carbon pricing, I've been doing that for years now. I mean, probably the number one comment I get from people is, I can't change my behavior, right? I still have to drive to work. I still have to do this. I still have to do that. And I think the truth is actually that consumers do change their behavior, but it takes a while for us to figure out how. But it doesn't take businesses very long to figure out how. And I think that's one reason why in the Climate Institute, they suggest that, the combined industrial and retail carbon price is going to be a little bit less than 50% of emissions reductions for the next, I think it was up until 2030. But 2/3 of that is the industrial carbon price.
And just to bounce off of that, I think that belies the problem of the rational human that economists, model out, and that in a lot of ways we're not as rational. And part of that is because we don't run Excel spreadsheets. When I'm buying a car, I just don't run the numbers as explicitly as, say, a business would. And so therefore, there's a lot more vibes going into these decisions than rational math.
Yeah. I mean, I know a couple of people in my life who actually do run Excel spreadsheets of basically every economic choice that they make. I am not one of them, but I agree with you. I think that I see both aspects of this, right? In that it does definitely make a choice. It makes a choice difference, right? Like if I go to a store and there are two items, one's more expensive than the other, I am going to make that choice probably in that moment to buy the least expensive item, all things being equal, right? Is that something that I'm necessarily planning out in a very logical way for the next 2 to 3 years? Maybe not. So while it is having an impact, it's maybe not having an impact in that sort of rationalistic way that business might think about it.
Yeah, but just because we're not walking into the grocery store with a spreadsheet doesn't mean over time that we are not effectively doing the same thing, because we do respond to price changes, right? We just don't respond to price changes typically right away, but we do over time. As the carbon price now is $80 a ton. So it's $80 a ton now, and it's going to go up by $15 every year. And I think it's just going to become clearer that people are, they're going to think more about their next car purchase. They're going to think more about their next furnace. They're going to think more about those groceries, whatever, is carbon intensive in their groceries. Things are more carbon intensive than others. So even though we don't literally do the spreadsheet, I do think we sort of grope toward it over time. So we may not, I try to not use the word rational and irrational, but anyway, we get there. We get there eventually.
Yeah, sure. But we have things on our mind and we make choices. I think all of us try to think ahead, right? Because whether or not we're thinking fully rationally or not, we are thinking ahead. And it ties into something that's interesting about this issue, right? Like at the end of the day, as a climate concerned person, part of the reason that I care so much about this issue is that I'm concerned about future generations. I'm concerned about my family, and I'm concerned about what people are going to have to grow up in. And I think, interestingly enough, for a lot of people who are maybe skeptical about the carbon pricing system, they're thinking about the same thing. It's just for them, maybe the seriousness of climate change isn't something that they fully considered yet. So they're not quite making maybe that calculation of this is a price I pay one way or the other, but I can pay it either in climate disasters or I can pay it in the form of a tax right now that actually helps prevent those things from happening. That does tie back into another thing, though, because there is the statement now, over 300 economists, last time I checked, came out saying that most families are getting more back from the rebates than they're paying into the carbon pricing system. I'm curious what your take on that is.
425, actually, last time I counted.
Okay.
So look, so I was one of the people that was writing that letter and signed the letter. And it was more than just the rebates that they were talking about, right? That letter was designed to say, look, there's a bunch of debate about carbon pricing, and there are a bunch of criticisms of carbon pricing, and let's take them on head on. And so I think there were 5 criticisms. And one of them was that it kind of makes no sense to have a rebate. Right. And to explain what the logic is of taxing with one hand and then rebating with another. And the logic is that the carbon tax isn't actually designed to make us poorer. That's not the point. The point of a carbon tax is to raise the price of carbon intensive things and to generate a substitution or a switch away from those things. And then the rebate is there to restore your purchasing power so that you're not actually poor as a result of the carbon price. And many people first of all, they don't know the logic of the carbon price. Many of them don't even know the rebate, but many of them don't even know the rebate's there. I think the government has done a pretty bad job in explaining what the rebate is for, that it is there, doesn't show up so clearly in your bank statement, and this idea that 80% of households get more back in the rebate than they will spend in higher prices. So all of this has been, I think, not well communicated and not well understood. But those 425 economists say it's a good idea.
And I quickly, just before we move on, who are these 425 economists? I mean, I know, and this is kind of a false question in that sense, because I've read the list, right? I know that these are people from multiple different backgrounds, that they come with a lot of expertise, that they don't necessarily come from like one view of seeing these things. But I'm curious, for maybe those who are going, well, these are just...
I mean, we started actually with the economists on the Eco-Fiscal Commission, right? We actually, kind of wrote this letter and went back and forth and said, hey, this is what we're trying to do. So we got the Eco-Fiscal commissioners to write the letter, and then we just sent it out. And we hoped that people would, I guess we posted it on a website and then we sent it out and directed people to it. And so, 425 people at last count had found it and signed it. But as to who they are, I mean, they're Canadian economists. I mean, most of them, I think, are academic economists, but probably not all of them. We've got people from all across the political spectrum there. They just happen to be economists.
Yeah. I mean, the economics theory behind this is pretty simple, right? Like this isn't all that controversial from an economic perspective. I think you kind of nailed it, though, in saying that a lot of people don't really know this is happening. And so if the execution of a great idea is poor, it can still be a poor idea. So we need to improve the execution so that the communication of this... I think I saw a headline flip over my screen a couple of weeks ago that there may be a law written that the banks actually have to use climate specific terminology and putting it on your bank statement.
I think that actually came out in the budget. I think it's that the banks have to use the new term, which is the Canadian carbon rebate. I think that's what it's called, because it got rebranded. So we'll see.
And other people have argued that the electronic transfers, I know it's cheaper, but give people a physical check where they have to look at the name and see the whatever $600 on it and walk down to the bank and put it in the slot. And then it reinforces that this is, if not a zero-sum game, maybe even a positive game for most people.
I agree completely with that. And even though it almost certainly is cheaper to have direct deposits, I actually think from a point of view of explaining the policy, it would be much better to have a check in the mail, a physical check in the mail. And I would add in that envelope a one-pager that says, here are tangible things you could do to reduce your carbon footprint. Because I think another problem is the economics is, we'll just put in a carbon price and it'll raise the relative prices of carbon intensive things. And then consumers will do the things that consumers do, right? They'll figure it out. But I think there's a lot of people, including me, who wonder, okay, like what should I do? What would be an easy thing to do? Like I've already switched out my furnace from an oil burning furnace to an electric furnace. So that was probably a big move, right? But what's my next move? And I don't know what it is, So my wife and I turned down our heat and we wear fleeces, but it's now electric heat. So that's actually not saving us emissions, right? But what are the other tangible things that we could do? Admittedly, they will be small things because we're just small people, right? We're just individual people. But I really think Canadians would like to know what are the things they can do. Yeah, you can drive less, right? Yes, you can, make your next car an electric car, but that's a big thing. We need tangible lists of little things that we could do.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad this conversation is heading in an area where I do have some expertise, communications, right? Like this is something that if you're one of those people who maybe feels on the fence about paying taxes in general, right? Like it could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. I don't really know. I think that's half the reason some of us have such a negative view of paying our taxes is because we don't always get, or it varies as to whether we know what we're doing is making a difference or not, right? Like we know that this money goes into that, and if we're having in our personal lives maybe a positive experience with the outcomes of paying taxes, then we might think very positively of it. On the other hand, if we haven't for some reason, but that funding actually is there for to help us in the moment that we need it, right? Like we might not have as positive a way of thinking of it because we're not as directly exposed to it. And I want to chat a little bit about some of the other impacts of carbon pricing. Before we do that, there's one big question that we've heard since the last podcast. I just want to ask, if most people are getting more back, how does it work? And I think that's what people are a bit confused about. Again, this is a question where I already kind of know the answer, but I'm curious to hear your take on what that is.
It goes back to this idea that the logic of a carbon price isn't about reducing my income, right? So some people say, well, in order to reduce emissions, you have to reduce my expenditure, right? Mm-hmm. If I spend less, then I'll spend less on carbon emitting things, and then they get it, right? But this is actually, and the logic of a carbon price isn't about spending less. It's about spending less on some things, spending less on carbon intensive things, spend less on gasoline, spend less on diesel, spend less on home heating fuel, but you can spend more on other things. Well, you can only spend less on these more expensive things and spend more on other things if your overall purchasing power is retained. And the rebate retains your purchasing power, or at least for 80%. For the 80%, all except the 20% richest households in a province, right? The bottom 80% will get as much or more back in the rebate than they will spend through the higher prices from the carbon price, okay? Mm-hmm. So I get it why people don't get it, right? Because they go, this is crazy. Why are you giving me back the money? Because the carbon price is actually still driving a behavioral change. And by the way, you can spend the rebate on anything you want, right? If you want to spend all of your rebate on gasoline, okay, then I guess your emissions probably won't go down, right? But most people are going to spend their rebate on a wide variety of things. They'll spend it on some groceries and some rent, and they'll save some of it, and they'll go out to a movie. And so they're going to spend it on a whole bunch of carbon unintensive things. Most people will. And so their overall emissions will go down over time.
And so I think this leads into the discussion of misinformation. So right now we have these great, I use in quotations, slogans that are going around, which aside from rhyming, I think viscerally is appealing to people because there is an affordability crisis going on right now. And so the idea that some things cost more because there's an extra tax on them kind of makes intuitive sense, unless you're really aware that you're getting the money back and that 80% are getting more than they would get, that they're actually benefiting from financially in real dollars from this transaction with the federal government. But I think that because of some of the communication issues and because of the simplicity, the easy grasp of these, it's something that people have latched on to in regards to the affordability crisis incorrectly. And that's why these kind of podcasts are important, because hopefully this goes to somebody who's not already in the converted and helps them to understand things a little bit better.
I agree with everything Joe just said, and I'll add to it one thing, is that there's another confusion, which is, and it has been very clear in the last couple of years, is what inflation really means. So inflation, of course, is prices going up, right? And between 2021, 2, and 3, prices were going up at 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, 8% at one point, right? They're now down to a 3% increase and maybe a little bit less than 3. Well, so that's one idea. Then the second idea is, well, a carbon price is driving up the price of things, right? Of carbon intensive things. Yes, it is. That's the logic. Well, it's clearly driving inflation. Well, okay. So here's the truth, is that a carbon price or a carbon tax does drive up the price of carbon intensive things. That's absolutely what it's supposed to do. No apology, okay? But as it turns out, carbon intensive things in the overall consumer basket of goods and services are actually pretty small. And so as a result, the evidence suggests, and this is studies done by the Bank of Canada, but also done by Trevor Toome and Jennifer Winter at University of Calgary, show that the inflation that we have experienced over the past few years was almost completely unrelated to the carbon price. Not absolutely zero, right? The Bank of Canada's number is that 1/20th of the inflation that we saw in that 21 to 23 period, 1/20th of it was coming from a carbon price. But that means 19/20ths of it was coming from other stuff, right? COVID, supply chain disruptions, pent-up demand, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, other stuff. But these two things, right, the carbon price kind of ramping up and this inflation happening, and these things came together. And in some sense, the carbon price has been a victim of a drive-by inflationing, right? I mean, this inflation happened. I actually think that, we would probably not be having this debate over the past 6 months about carbon pricing that we have had if we hadn't seen that inflation from 2021 to 2023. But we did. So, these issues get kind of conflated. You got to explain them, and here we are.
And if I may add, what does and will continue to impact inflation is climate change, and in particular in regards to food. And as we have increasing crop issues around the world, rice in Southeast Asia has been impacted by recent summers. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the UK has basically lost its entire vegetable crop this year, and that's in conjunction with Europe as well. So we're going to have increasing food prices, and it's not going to be from the carbon price. It's going to be from the climate crisis. And whether people make those connections or not, I'm not sure. But I'm very partial to food. I really like food. I eat food almost every day. So it's really important to me, and I'm sure I'm not alone out there.
Yeah.
I'd say I'm on an almost everyday eat food basis most days as well. It's interesting. So I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador. In fact, I'm joining you from there right now. And in fact, this weekend coming up, we have an event on carbon pricing where we're going to be holding it in St. John's. And I think a lot of people who maybe are from a more rural place or have lived outside of a big city in Canada are immediately going to jump to the assumption that because I live a lifestyle that has more dependency on those carbon intensive things, right? Like trucks, actually, sometimes those things are necessary. You live out in the middle of the woods and you're hauling wood for, you maybe burn wood as heat, right? Like that's not necessarily unheard of. And so that those things are something that they rely upon. My understanding is that there's the rural rebate offset really that takes care of the carbon pricing aspect of the cost. But when you're talking about the climate change impacts, there's no way to like really, and I mean, I studied rural climate change adaptation. There's no way to really prevent those costs in the long term, especially if you live somewhere rural. There's no way to just prepare rural communities enough across all of Canada for the impacts that are coming that would make those impacts less in a meaningful way. So, I mean, I feel like I've answered my own question here, but I am curious to get into what are some of the other benefits of having carbon pricing? What are some of the things that we're preventing as a result of this?
Well, just one more addition is that because a lot of rural folk are farmers, it's important to note that there is an exemption on any fuel related to agriculture as well. So
in vehicles,
yeah.
Right. But one of the issues in agriculture is the use of natural gas or propane to dry your crops. There currently isn't an exemption on that, right? There is an exemption on the tractors and the farm vehicles, but there's not an exemption on the stuff on the fuels to dry your crops, and that's an issue. I mean, that's an issue. There's a bill actually going through the House, maybe now in the Senate, that is about asking for these exemptions. And of course, if you go back 6 months to when the exemption was introduced for home heating fuel, right? Exemptions tend to beget exemptions, right? As soon as you open the door to any kind of an exemption, somebody else says, well, hold on, how about me? How about my situation? Why don't you exempt me? Why is that guy more special than me? Which is the number one argument against exemptions.
And I think the thing that's going to make this very hard for the federal government to continue with this specific policy. I don't know. I have a couple kids that are 2 years apart, and I'm sure it was around the age of 1 that if I gave my older kid a little bit of a bigger cookie and that my younger kid a little bit of a smaller piece of cookie, my 1-year-old would scream bloody murder. Like that's how innate fairness is ingrained in our system. I think in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's food, shelter, and then fairness. Like I think it's like right there. And so and I don't know how you're the policy wonk, Chris. I don't know how the government gets out of that trap, because that's a real trap they set for themselves.
Well, I think the way you get out of that, I guess I was in favor when they did that of not doing that. And I said, within a week, maybe you should just go back on it and remove that exemption. So I think the government hurt themselves for sure and hurt the future of this policy with that exemption. But that was back in October. Then, so that issue was live for a while. Then, of course, came April 1st. And so the issue was live again. And the opponents of the policy keep talking about it. It's died down a little bit now, but it's died down a little bit in a sort of a day-to-day news cycle sense. I think it would be a shame to lose the carbon tax, but I think it would be a bigger shame to lose the carbon tax and then put nothing in its place, right? So, people ask me whether I fear the future of the carbon tax. Yes, but I also fear the future of climate policy more generally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other policies that were equally effective but higher cost, well, okay, I would say, geez, that's too bad. It would be nicer to use a lower cost carbon price than a higher cost something else. But at least you would have done something, because I think this is a serious problem and I think we should be addressing it.
I think it's part of an issue when, and I, through my work, deal with climate misinformation on basically a daily basis. There's not a day that I'm not dealing with it, right, at this point. There's a nuance about climate policy in general that we've lost in the last little while, where the debates that get had about this, we're actually seeing a rise in the amount of belief that climate change isn't even real. amongst people. And I think that's a sad reality to have to face, because now we're facing a situation where instead of debating the merits of aspects of policy, right, that could be implemented in different ways. I mean, there could be a new way of doing carbon pricing or something like that we could figure out. And if we sat down and we actually talked it out, maybe there would be a way to do that. But that's not the discussions that we're having. We're having discussions about, should we, in essence, it's become an issue of, should we have climate policy for many people, or should we have no climate policies? And that does become extremely problematic. I want to just move a little bit into something that's, I think, an under-discussed aspect of this, is that there do appear to be, from the research I was reading, impacts on carbon pricing on immediate air emission reductions, basically. And I'm curious, like, are there more tangible ways in which this helps people that maybe we don't talk about as much as we should?
Well, from a physician's perspective, I think talking about the health co-benefits of climate policy writ large is really important. I know from my coal phase out time that the general public seems to care more about the 100 deaths that are going to be prevented by the coal phase out per year right now from air pollution, more than, say, the foreseeable deaths that will come from the changing climate in 10 to 20 years. It's just a lot more immediate. And of course, there's a multitude of harms that come to the health that comes from climate. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the planetary health field has become more elevated over time, because I think policymakers are seeing that as well, that it's just a lot more concrete, hold in your hand effect that you can see there. I don't know about that specific to carbon pricing, but certainly to any kind of climate policy.
Yeah, I actually think the air particulates from coal is the big one. And in fact, some people have argued that the way that the coal phase out happened in Ontario, what really made it work in a policy sense was the argument based on health, on air particulates and health, rather than emissions and climate change. What really made it tangible and what really made it politically salient, politically important, was the local health effects. Great. And that's so fabulous. So you get a twofer on that one, right? You get the reduced emissions and you get the better health. But once you phase out coal, well, then you're now going from natural gas, let's say, to electric. Then you don't get at least so many of those such obvious local health benefits.
But we do have wildfire smoke, yes, which is very tangible. I mean, I just feel so anxious when the wildfire smoke envelops my city, and it's obviously directly related to climate, and it's obviously getting worse, at least in Western Canada. And so I think from my perspective as a health professional, I think it's really important to keep pointing out that this wildfire smoke isn't just coming out of nowhere. It's coming because of choices we've made, and we can make things better if we make better choices.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But here's where I think supporters of the carbon price might run into some trouble, which is somebody might say, well, great. So are you telling me that a carbon price today is going to reduce wildfires this summer? And I think the honest truth is, well, no, it's not. Today's carbon price in Canada is probably going to have a zero impact on this summer's wildfires, or the ones that we expect to happen. But this year's carbon price in Canada and elsewhere over time are going to help to stabilize the climate. So again, this is not a great political pitch, because it really is a long run pitch. It's basically saying, this is a big problem. We can't get short run payoffs, but we can get long run payoffs, and let's not forget those. You got to say today's carbon price here and elsewhere is so that we can reduce emissions, so that we can help to stabilize the climate, so that we can actually have a reduced frequency of those wildfires. And we may not get that payoff for several years.
Yeah, no, I think the way that I think the way that I've approached it, and I will continue to approach it, is, I mean, obviously when these wildfire events happen, as somebody who's interested in climate, as somebody who's interested in air pollution, I get interviewed a lot by the media. And so when I have those conversations, it's always, these are the ways you can protect yourself now, and we need to burn less fossil fuels. And and I think by adding that second part, it actually it is important, because otherwise we're just focusing on the now and not on the future. And I think I would, if any doctors are listening out there or other pundits, just throw that in every time the wild, because there's going to be more wildfires this summer. We need to throw in that second part.
I just finished another podcast episode actually with somebody who works with, we have these wild child children's programs at Sierra Club Canada where we get kids out into nature for, tens of thousands of hours every year. That's the sales pitch. There you go. One of the interesting things that came up in the interview was, in the wake of Hurricane Fiona, kids actually seeing some of the devastation in nature. And the thing that I'm reminded of, and in all of our communications, I think, when we talk about the connection between climate policy and preventing wildfires, is it's not, yes, what we're seeing now are the things that are going to get worse in the future. What we're seeing now is the indication of what could get worse in the future if we're not acting now. And those kids who are already seeing those present impacts now, they're over their lifespan, can have, there's a couple of different ways that can go. Either we act now and over the course of their lifespan, things are better or less worse, I suppose, or they get much, much worse because we didn't do anything in terms of climate policy. On that note, I'm curious about, there's one other point that I'd love to get to before we end today, which is, why should this burden be put on Canada? I think that's one other question that we had back. This is something we get a lot. Again, I'm asking this question. I'm curious to hear your responses. I also kind of already know the answer, but I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I can give you the populist answer, and then Chris can give you the actual answer. Well, this is a collective action problem. And when you have collective action problems, you all have to be involved. I pay a very, very small portion of the federal tax that goes into funding our federal government. But I'm still obligated as a Canadian citizen to pay my taxes, even though it's a very, very small amount. Because if everybody had the attitude that my part is very, very small, then suddenly there's an impact on the federal revenue writ large. The other example I use is that Canada was only about 2% of the World War II effort. And yet nobody would ever suggest that wasn't important for Canada to be there on the stage. And then I guess my final answer is, we're one of the richest countries in the world, and therefore we need to play our part. And if we don't, then China's easy. We can say, well, China's over there doing all those emissions, and therefore they have to do all the work. And then China can be over there and say, okay, but Canada is so rich, why aren't they doing their part? And then Bangladesh can go, well, even though there's a lot of us and we're very poor, we should have no role. And then everybody points in every direction and nobody gets anything done. So we actually, I would argue, have a heightened responsibility, because we, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, are petro-states and have actually contributed more to this in our production of fossil fuels than many other places in the world. So yeah, we need to play our part. Chris, you can give the real answer now.
Well, I agree with everything I just heard, but I will just add this. If I knew with certainty, this is a global collective action problem, okay? It absolutely is. And if I knew with certainty that 80%, 90% of the emissions out there in the world, or those countries, were not going to act to reduce their emissions, if I knew with certainty that they would not act, then I would say, I guess we shouldn't act either, because there would be no point. And I guess then we'd just all be screwed with climate change, right? But I don't know that. And in fact, a whole bunch of countries are acting. Canada's not the leader on this file. Canada's not the laggard, but we're not the leader. So there's 25% of emissions globally are priced. And there's other countries like the United States that are dealing with climate change, even though they're not using carbon pricing. So countries are acting on climate change. And if we want other countries to act on climate change and want them to act more on climate change, how do we possibly do that without acting ourselves? But there was a time when we would actually go to these meetings and say, yes, 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 you should all do this. And then we would come home and do nothing. Okay. Well, we're now in a much better situation where our federal government can go to these international meetings and say, you know what, we've got a carbon price across the country. In a couple of places, it's provincial, but in most places, it's federal. But it doesn't matter, federal or provincial. We've got a carbon price across the country. We're taking climate change seriously. And it's not killing us. The sky's not falling. This policy is working. It's working well. And we think you should do more too. And we'll do more if you do more. Well, you just can't say that if we're not doing anything domestically. But you can absolutely say that if we are doing something domestically. And I don't think the option here is that we all sit around and do nothing, because then, the world just burns. So why is that a good outcome?
Well, and one more addition to that is the fact that the energy transition is real. It's happening around the world. We're seeing it not just within governments, but within companies. And Canada wants to be a part of that. Look at all these, electric vehicle announcements that have happened over the last few weeks in Ontario. That's exciting. It's exciting to be a part of this transition. And when you look to a place like China that has a decade of actually working hard on being a part of that transition, we don't want to be left behind by this great economic opportunity that's going to have to happen if we want to save ourselves. So there's a good hero story in let's be a part of the good change that's happening in the world.
Well, and there is an opportunity. I mean, as the world decides to reduce emissions, the world will be looking for ways to do that. They will be looking for clean technologies. I don't think there's anything that guarantees that Canada will be at the front of that parade and we will be the leading exporter. But if we could develop some of those technologies and then export to the world, wouldn't that be a good thing, right? So there's nothing that guarantees that we will do that, but there is an opportunity there that we should certainly think about and hopefully capitalize on.
Well, yeah, and it comes back to me, like, if you're a nationalist listening to this podcast and that's what you care about and you really want to be ahead, well, I hate to say it, but there's a lot of countries that are going even faster than us and trying to corner green markets and control the supply chains for those industries. And, we can fall behind and be dependent upon that, or we can develop our own industries. We can, also develop green technologies in a way, and we can remain competitive, right? Because that is the real competition. I want to just, before we end today, if you've got any more things you'd like to say or things maybe we didn't cover, I want to open the floor just in case there's anything we missed.
I just think there's a bit of gamification that's going on with climate policy at this point, in that I'm seeing these simple messages happening not only at the governmental level but within corporations. If we can just skirt these policies, not do our role, let's see what we can do. And I think we've forgotten in some ways that there are consequences to these decisions. So, right, you might win the short-term war, but in the long run, we face an existential crisis, and we need to do, this is a true emergency, this is a true crisis, and we need to be acting like it. And I feel like the gamification that I'm seeing some people play neglects the important speed and depth of change that we need to do in order to save ourselves. I mean, I do this because I have an 18-year-old, I have a 16-year-old. Honestly, I've had a good life. I'm only 55, but it'd be fine if things ended on my account. But for them, man, they deserve everything, and so that's why I care. And I think more people should do this out of love.
So now that Joe has said that, I will say something, which is completely consistent with what Joe just said. So the gamification that he's talking about, I mean, one version of it is, if I don't have to reduce my emissions, I won't reduce my emissions. I'll let somebody else reduce their emissions because I can maybe cut my costs or, make more profits, without behaving that way. This is the beauty of a carbon price. A carbon price, the whole logic of a carbon price is to align private interests with the public interest. The public interest here, pretty clearly, is that we reduce emissions. The private interest, generally, right, is to cut costs and increase profits, right? That's generally what the private interest is if we're talking about the business private interests. But if you actually attach a price on carbon and you make those private businesses or private consumers pay the social cost of their emissions, then all of a sudden you have aligned their private interests with the public interest. And I think that is the beauty of a carbon pricing policy. And it's the beauty of most pricing policies if they are designed and implemented well. And then you don't have to worry too much about the gaming, as long as you are putting a good policy in place and enforcing it properly, right? Then you can just let private interests be private interests, and you know that they'll end up, matching up with the public interest.
And most people, again, most households getting more back, and on top of that, maybe better communications on policies like this. Yeah. Joe, Chris, I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me on.
Having us.
Hi, everybody. So I wanted to end this episode by talking about what is probably, by the time this airs, quite well-known news, that we are going into, yet again, another extremely dangerous wildfire season in Canada. And what I say here is just my own views. It's not the views of the guests who joined earlier, but it is something that I think is important to say. As we talked about in the podcast, right, there's a lot of ways that we can be doing things now that are going to help prevent impacts like this from happening in the future. We watched in the past severe storms, things like Hurricane Fiona, caused a lot of devastation to coastal communities. We saw that in Newfoundland and Labrador. We see that in communities across the Atlantic provinces. We see forest fires also in those same communities and elsewhere in Canada, in Western Canada, in the north, where it impacts a lot of people. People have lost lives. People have had to take incredible risks as, among other things, forest firefighters. Healthcare professionals have had to do a hell of a lot in order to try to make the situation a little bit better for people. And I think one of the big impacts that we talked about today, a little bit in the podcast, but one thing that we need to talk about in general is the impact of misinformation. Because while the misinformation we're dealing with today threatens to set into place a lot more fires like the ones that we are seeing, while the misinformation that we're dealing with, primarily from the oil and gas industry today, will make things much, much worse in the future, we have to remember that the events that we are seeing today were also caused by misinformation in the past. Really campaigns that have been going on for decades now. Driven by the oil and gas industry, driven by those with some sort of way to profit off of it. And it comes down to something very simple. I mean, it's funny, for all the conspiracy theories around forest fires being started by arsonists and everything, it's the easiest answer, the simplest answer, if you really want to look at it scientifically, is just that we are dealing with climate change. We're dealing with these impacts. We're dealing with it because some people wanted to make a lot of profit, and they didn't care what happened to other people in the process. And they are making a lot of profit. A huge amount of the inflation that we do see goes to oil and gas and mining extraction profits. That's a real cause of inflation. And those profits are being made while Canadians struggle, not only with inflation, but now with the impacts of climate change, which are going to make, as we discussed, things like inflation a lot worse. I think people are going to have a lot of questions about what's going on. I think this forest fire season is probably going to be quite bad for a lot of people. It already is by the time we're recording this. I think that if you're going to chat about this with other people, and you should, don't be afraid to talk about the blame. The blame does lie in the misinformation that was put out there for a reason, for a purpose, to make money, to continue making money. And it's not that individual people are to blame for the emissions they did. I mean, everybody's just doing what they're trying to do. But the point of strong climate policies is to try and make that job easier, to try and make it more fair across society, and to try and make the biggest polluters do the most. So you're going to see things in the future around, for instance, Canada's emissions cap. And it's vital that we have an emissions cap. I don't know that everybody in the podcast is going to agree with me on that one. We don't necessarily have to agree with each other on everything. We don't need to agree on everything, but we do need to know that climate change is serious. We do need to know that there's a serious impact, and we do need to know what's causing it, which is the combustion of oil and gas, the combustion of fossil fuels, which is preventable. The question is not, could we have a green future? The question is, why are we being held back from having one? Because it's right there. It is possible. We can do it. It is foreseeable. It is in many ways something, in fact, that we are more at risk of falling behind other places in doing than we are of not achieving. The only reason we would not achieve it is if that misinformation is just allowed to spread like wildfire, to spread far and wide, and to cause damage and to hold the rest of us, all of us really, back. And I think that that's something that you have to talk with other people about. We have a bunch of resources on our website that you can check out in this respect. Encourage you to do so. There's a lot of information there. We won't be getting to a full Q&A this week. I am away for a bit, but we will be doing one on the next episode. So if you have questions that came out of this episode, or if you have questions about any of our episodes, or if you have questions about just anything to do with the environment, or if you need to reach out with thoughts on how you're feeling because of how everything is going right now, please do. When you hear this, please feel like you can write us an email. We'll be happy to read it. Might be a little while before we get back to you, but we will get back to you. And we will be happy to talk about it in the next podcast. And if you want to hold events in your community to counter misinformation, you should do that. And if you want to talk to others, and that's what you can do, you should do that. But we all have that ability to have those conversations, and I encourage you to have those conversations because they are easier than you think. But the important thing is to focus on talking to the right people. Talk to people who are actually willing to listen to you. And talk to lots of people. Talking to the same person 10 times, who already know, who maybe already agrees with you or already completely disagrees with you, doesn't do a lot of good. But talking to 10 people who are on the fence about these issues, that does a lot of good. So anyway, those are some final thoughts, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. Once again, thank you to our guests, and stay tuned. Before we end today, a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.